the sun shines on Biloxi. The air is filled with vapors from the sea, and the boy will dig a pool beside the ocean.
I grew up in the Depression. We didn't have much money in our house, but we had a lot of music and books. My mother was a very fine pianist. My father was a musicologist who had a music shop with a lot of records. And we had books in the house, and my grandfather had books, and the public library had books. So I remember my childhood as one of involving a lot of reading in addition to playing sports. I had been intrigued with the idea of oral history, and so I began to write that book by pretending my mother and my brother and other relatives were speaking into a tape, which of course they weren't. It was totally made up. I was trying to duplicate or render the kind of speech that goes into an oral history when a person who's not a writer starts to talk about his or her life. John Jameson was not unprepared. As far back as September, when the news had come that Hood had pulled out and the Union armies had Atlanta, he sat Mattie down and told her what had to be done. The rugs were rolled, the art was taken down from the walls, her needlepoint chairs, whatever she valued, he told her, her English fabrics, the china, even her family Bible. It was all to be packed up and carted to Milledgeville and thence put on the train to Savannah, where John's cotton broker had agreed to store their things in the warehouse. Not my piano, she'd said, that will stay. It would rot in the dampness of that place. As you wish, John had said, having no feeling for music in any case. Mattie was dismayed to see her home so depleted. Through the bare windows, the sun shone, lighting up the floors, as if her life were going backward, and she was again a young bride in a new-built, unfurnished manse, and with a somewhat frightening husband twice her age. She wondered how John knew the war would touch them directly. In fact, he didn't. But he was a man whose success gave him reason to suppose he was smarter than most people. He had a presence with his voluminous chest and large head of wild white hair. Don't argue with me, Mattie. They lost 20 or 30,000 men taking that city. There's hell to pay. You're a general with a president who's a madman. Would you just sit there? So where? In Augusta? To Macon? Then how will he ride if not through the hills? And don't expect that poor excuse for a rebel army to do anything about it. But if I'm wrong, and I pray God I am, what will I have lost? Tell me. Mattie was not allowed to disagree in such matters. She felt even more dismayed and said not a thing when, with the crops in, John arranged to sell away his dozen prime field hands. They were bound, all of them, to a dealer in Columbia, South Carolina. When the day came and they were put in shackles into the wagon, she had to run upstairs and cover her ears so as not to hear the families wailing down in the shacks. All John had said was, "No buck nigger of mine will ever wear a federal uniform, I promise you that." But for all his warning and preparation, she could not believe the moment had come to leave Fieldston. The fear made her legs weak. She couldn't imagine how to live except in her own home with her own things and the Georgian world arranged to provide her and her family what their station demanded. And though Aunt Letitia was gone, she had infected them with her panic. For all his foresight, John was running around this way and that, red-faced, shouting and giving orders. And the boys, roused out of bed and still only half-dressed, came down the stairs with their rifles and ran out through the back. Mattie went to her bedroom and stood, not knowing where to start. She heard herself whimpering. Somehow she dressed and grabbed whatever she could from her armoire and bath and threw everything into 2 portmanteaus. She heard a gunshot and, looking out the back window, saw one of the mules go down on its knees. Roscoe was leading another one from the stable, while her older boy, John Jr., primed his rifle. It seemed only minutes later, with the sun barely on the treetops, that the carriages were waiting out front. Where were they to eat? Where were they to seat themselves? Both carriages were loaded with luggage in food hampers, in sacks of sugar and flour, and now the morning breeze brought the smoke around from the stacks where John had set the fodder alight, and Mattie felt it was her own sooty light sky. When the Jamesons were gone, Pearl stood in the gravel path, still holding her satchel. The massa had only glanced at her before laying his whip on the horses. Roscoe, driving the second carriage, had come past her, and without looking, dropped at her feet something knotted in a handkerchief. She made no move to retrieve it. She waited in the peace and silence of their having gone. She felt the cool breeze on her legs. Then the air grew still and warm, and after a moment in which the earth seemed to draw its breath, the morning sun spread in a rush over the plantation. Only then did she pick up what Roscoe had dropped. She knew immediately what it was through the cloth. The same 2 gold coins he had showed her once when she was little. His life savings. "They're real, Miss Pearl," he had said. "You put 'em between your teeth, you taste how real they is. You see them eagles, you get a passel of these, and you can fly like the eagles high over the earth. That's what the eagles mean on these monies." Pearl felt the hot tears in her throat. She went around the big house, past the outbuildings and the smoking fodder and the dead mules, past the slave quarters where they were busy singing and putting their things together, and down along the trail through the woods to where the massa had given leave to lay out a graveyard. There were by now 6 graves in this damp clearing, each marked by a wooden shingle with the person's name scratched in. The older grave mounds, like her mother's, were covered with moss. Pearl squatted and read the name aloud. Nancy Wilkins. "Mama," she said, "I free. You told me, my child, my darling Pearl, you will be free. So these gone and I is, I free. Free like no one else in the whole world but me. That's how free."
The sun shines on Biloxi.